Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar, Help My Teams Are Agile but My Execs Are Waterfall. We had nearly 1,000 people register for today's webinar, so thanks to everyone for taking time out of their day to be a part of this presentation. Today's webinar is being presented by Hunter McCluer, Agile Delivery Lead at Eliassen Group, as well as Scott Blacker, Vice President of Product at AgileCraft. We're going to go ahead and get started here in just a couple of minutes. Just to start off and premise the webinar, we will be answering questions at the end of today, so please feel free to ask questions as we go, and we'll get to as many questions as possible at the end of today's webinar. Whatever questions we don't get to, we'll certainly be able to follow up with you post-webinar. Also, we will be recording to today's webinar, so please stay tuned for an email from us with the follow-up, which will include the recording and the slide deck. We hope that you share this with others that might be interested in the topic. From here, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to pass this along to Hunter McCluer, who will start us off.
Home for all of us. The game, as we all know, is really changing rapidly for anyone in the software industry. Well, many times in the past we thought of software as an after product or service, an aftermarket item once the product or service was identified, and in some cases even sold. Many of our clients today consider software and their company's ability to deliver software a very strategic asset. The acceleration, as we know, of technology is quickening every day, every month. A great article on this, if you haven't seen it yet, is the May 2016 Harvard Business Review Embracing Agile article. It really goes through a lot of great information and highlights this fact. And as we know, software is every day increasing more and more as a strategic differentiator for our clients. So more clients today than ever before are reaching out to Eliassen, asking for Agile transformation assistance and letting us know that their ability to design and deliver software in a rapid environment is critical for them. Next slide, please, Lexi. So our goal today is to kind of cover these 4 questions for you all in our webinar. How do I translate waterfall style, traditional linear portfolio planning cycles and teams into Agile and understand how they work with Agile execution? How do I resource waterfall projects in Agile delivery organizations? That's a big one for a lot of our customers. How do I efficiently and effectively manage dependencies in and across Agile projects? Another huge one for Agile teams that are looking to scale, and I must say AgileCraft provides some really elegant solutions in this area. And finally, how do I report and continue to update stakeholders, teams, and leaderships on projects when Agile teams are reporting progress and story points? Next slide, Lexi. So the state of Agile, again, to just expand a little bit more on one of the previous slides. A lot of us, like me, that started out on Card Punch have seen a pretty dramatic change over the coming years. In the Agile world, we really started to see this transformation kick in around 1994, when a lot of teams were in the early versions of XP, paired programming, really looking for ways to deliver software differently, more efficiently. In those days, of course, many of them were pilot projects or small teams. Around 2002 up to about 2010, teams really started to understand requirements and testing, what a lot of people think of as the 2 pillars of the delivery pipeline, needed to be involved. It wasn't just a development testing issue, it was an issue to be included for all teams. And certainly from about 2010 on, we really started to see Agile transformations happening at scale across entire organizations and portfolios, not just IT teams, but across the business overall.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Hunter, and I can chime in here a little bit. I think this is largely where AgileCraft came in, right? As we saw the evolution of the Agile industry move from kind of core team tools to expand into the DevOps space, and then ultimately starting to address the concepts of Agile at scale, it became clear that the tools that were out there that were designed primarily for teams weren't really tuned to help organizations scale up through the program, portfolio, and then ultimately up to the enterprise. And that's where AgileCraft came in. Now, one of the things that we've noticed, and if you can jump over to the next slide, Lexi, is that it's not just about scaling agility and driving agile practices from the top to the bottom. While we'd like to think that every organization can be agile from every engineer all the way up through the CEO, the reality is that many organizations live in what's called a bimodal world. This is a term that was coined by Gartner a couple of years ago, and it refers to the existence of both traditional and agile practices within an organization at the same time. Now, technically, Gartner will refer to this as mode 1 and mode 2, and so we've looked to adopt this in a couple of ways. And we can think about it traditionally in a horizontal way, where some teams might be waterfall or doing traditional development activities, and other teams might be agile, and we need to figure out how to align these teams so they can work together. But another way to think about bimodal, if you reverse the axis a little bit, is to think about it vertically, where the teams themselves may be agile, but the portfolio organization, the enterprise itself at the top levels, hasn't yet made that transition. And that's really where you get into the spot. If you're a PMO and your teams are agile, but your executives are waterfall, what do you do, and how do you tackle that problem, and how do you translate between the strategic planning that's happening in a very traditional way and the teams who are executing in an agile way, and then how do you report on that information back up to address information in the way that executives want to consume it. And so if you jump over to the next slide real quick, we see, and we worked with dozens and dozens of large organizations, is that we can think of this in terms of 4 stages of bimodal evolution. And if you look at the far left, this is the A's here, agile, and the T's are traditional. Many organizations, particularly today, are in a spot where some of their teams and some of their programs are agile, and many are still traditional. And they're sort of intermixed, and it's somewhat hit and miss as organizations undergo an agile transformation. But the top levels tend to be very traditional. And so I think, as we talk to organizations and do this talk, we find that 80 to 90% of companies, organizations, agencies generally fit into that pattern. Now, today's talk is primarily about the second circle here, where the teams have made the transition from agile, and maybe even at the program level, but the portfolio is still very much traditional. And what do you do? Now, looking forward, organizations tend to aspire to one of 2 places. One would be what Gartner would say is the bimodal organization, where agile projects are agile, traditional projects are traditional, and there's a thin layer at the very top to tie those 2 together from a strategic planning perspective. And then some organizations do look to go top to bottom agile, where the entire pyramid is. And so from today's perspective, most tend to be in 1 or 2, and moving to 3 or 4, depending on the organization and what they're trying to accomplish. And so next slide, Lexi. Thank you. The important thing here is that, these are, it's not that Waterfall is from Mars and Agile is from Venus, or vice versa, and that there's just no way for, these 2 sides to communicate. The idea is that Waterfall and Lean Agile thinking needs to come together in large organizations and coexist. Whether or not that's a temporary mindset as organizations transition to full agility, or it's the new norm from a planning, budgeting, dependency management, governance perspective, all these things need to align and coexist. And in order to drive that, we'll walk through today some very tactical tips and methodologies that we've seen organizations adopt very successfully to drive the alignment, the coexistence, and the collaboration between these waterfall and lean agile mindsets. So next slide, please. So just to frame up the conversation, we can think about scale at 4 levels, and there are many frameworks out there. SAFe is a common one, DAD, LESS, but generally, agility is thought of at 4 levels within an organization. Team, where work gets done. This is the developers themselves who are actually executing the work. the program level where work is coordinated, dependencies are managed, right? Features and epics are aligned and planned. Portfolio where, and if you think of the enterprise level as where strategy and mission and vision and budgets are set, the portfolio level would help map and all of that budgeting and strategic direction down to the programs who are looking to execute it as the primary function. And if you go to the next slide, we've seen historically a gap between the team and the program level. And so you can think of this as sort of Gen 1 Agile, where team-level tools emerged in order to help individual pockets of developers execute. And then the program, there really was not a good way to coordinate program, portfolio, and enterprise thinking. All of that was still very much traditional. Well, as Agile has evolved, and if you go to the next slide, we see the gap really moving from where tools were just team tools to today, where some tools are starting to encompass both the program level, and some tools are looking to extend, including AgileCraft, agility from team to program to portfolio to enterprise, and that's one of the things that we do. However, if the organization at the top level, the portfolio and enterprise level, is still traditional, and the teams and the programs are still agile, what are you going to do? How do you connect those two things? And what we see today is most organizations basically fall into this PowerPoint and Excel gap right in the middle there, where the teams and maybe even the programs are driving agile practices, but the portfolio and enterprise are not. And so information is pulled manually from systems, coordinated, massaged into reports, and then ultimately presented to management. And one of the things that we're looking to do at AgileCraft, and one of the trends that we see, is the kind of alignment of team and program to traditional program and enterprise, and making that work in a very real way for organizations. From a tooling perspective, AgileCraft addresses this and allows for a unified team to enterprise execution, regardless of the methodology at different levels of scale. Now, what we're seeing is that there's a reason why organizations are looking to not go top to bottom agile right away, but align to traditional portfolio and enterprises as a way of bridging the gap during their agile transformation. And if you can go to the next slide, there are generally 3 reasons why organizations look to embrace bimodal. One is from a risk perspective. I think organizations are looking to de-risk agile transformations, and when there are kind of large portions at the portfolio level or excuse me, or individuals or groups within the company that don't really see the vision of the organization as a whole really embracing agility, allowing some parts of the organization to keep operating using their existing models. And this can apply to waterfall teams or traditional teams, as well as to entire PMOs who are looking to maintain their current methodologies, trying to figure out what this agile thing is about, how to handle lean agile budgeting and things of that nature. Allowing the PMO or the executive branch to maintain their current methodologies can de-risk agile transformations by bringing along the entire organization and not forcing everybody to change overnight. Also, the existence of 2 modes can help optimize software delivery for organizations where there are very real and compelling reasons why some parts may want to deliver in an agile fashion and others in a more traditional fashion. And then finally, from a full product or full software development perspective, it can be really important to bring everybody along. And when tools or processes are optimized for only one mode of delivery, you can find that organizations start to fragment, reporting becomes siloed, and you start to get full visibility into what the entire organization is trying to accomplish. I don't know, if Hunter, if you had anything to add in there, go ahead, feel free.
Oh yes, and great point, Scott. Thank you. You know, the theory and practice of bimodal communication and understanding really goes a long way, as you mentioned, in establishing that initial and ongoing alignment, transparency, and balance between the executives, the PMO, the teams, the traditional waterfall as we think of them, not only teams but portfolio management and the agile teams that are emerging or have been emerging maybe for a couple of years inside an organization. These three things, that alignment, transparency, and balance you talk about, are critical for organizations to be able not only to resolve and move forward, but then to scale their agile work. My wife and I have been together for 35 years, and I love the Venus and Mars comparison, and I've recently started telling my wife, honey, it's not that I don't understand you, we're bimodal, but it doesn't seem to be winning a lot of points. But as you mentioned, we see the initial struggles so often in our client agile transformations are around this disconnect, this bimodal understanding. So it's really great in the beginning of a transformation to drive that communication, that clarity, these key foundational items. One of the neat things, real world example, I'm really excited our two companies are on site at a very large entertainment organization who is really, as you say, at phase 2 in the 4 stages of their bimodal transformation or their agile transformation, and really working to take them from basically an initial program level up to that portfolio level and potential enterprise level. So between the coaching, the transformation work, and a lot of the awareness and the information that AgileCraft provides, I really think we're going to have a lot of success with that client.
Great.
Lexi, can you take us to the next slide?
Yep, great. And so thanks, Hunter. And to kind of kick us off here into some of the tactics and the, what we'll call the 6 steps to effective bimodal execution, there is something that's really important to get aligned to across the organization. And as simple as it may sound, it's the semantics of agile and traditional. And at times the methodologies can feel very different, but and particularly since there's been a large adoption within the agile community of terms that have had very different meaning for traditional PMOs. And there's no better example of that than a program. And a program has specific meaning to a traditional PMO. It refers to a kind of broad set of funded objects that are funded initiatives that otherwise known as projects that are all working towards a common end under a common theme, if you will, of what an organization is trying to accomplish. And so when we talk to PMOs, that we always get the question, well, what's a program? How do I manage my programs and projects within AgileCraft in order to execute agile execution? And we say, well, okay, a project is a funded thing. It's something that has a business case associated with it, and it's something that is of strategic importance to the business that's under the guidance of a larger program the business is trying to execute towards. And well, hey, we know what that is in Agile. A project sounds a lot like an epic, right? We have an epic backlog within our portfolio backlog. Those epics have lightweight business cases associated to them. Those epics roll up to strategic themes that represent long-standing things the business is trying to accomplish, i.e. programs. And so it can be a little bit eye-opening at times. Well, hey, okay, a project, what if we treat a project as an epic? And now the Agile team is saying, hey, I know what a project is. That's just an epic. I'll go break it down into features and stories and tasks and get to work. And by the way, as I execute those features and tasks and stories, I can report back on my progress against that epic, i.e. that project. And then there are some funding and translation mechanisms, which we'll get into in a bit, that allow me to translate the work that's being done by the Agile teams back up into traditional metrics such as kind of budgeting, looking at capitalization, things of that nature. So I think the theme epic project program paradigm and aligning those things, an epic to a project, a theme to a program, is one of those things that can be very eye-opening and sort of open the door for much simpler translation between agile execution and traditional portfolio management. Same thing on the feature side. I think at some point for some to say a feature is a requirement might be a little anathema. But if you think about it, right, as an epic gets broken down into features and stories, An epic at times can be thought of as the larger market requirements. Features can be thought of as business requirements, right? Stories as kind of a more granular breakdown of that. And so it's not from the waterfall execution perspective of I want to define all this stuff up front, but more in the work breakdown structure and the mirroring of those two things have. And I think it's really important that especially when looking at a bimodal world, that you just get real and not try and be pure, right? When you may wind up doing things that are quote unquote not agile in the most purest sense, right? Story points are a great example. They're a critical element of driving effective agile process. And as an agilist, I would never say that we should translate story points to person weeks. It almost kind of breaks the paradigm of what makes those teams successful. But at some point, from an executive reporting standpoint, particularly if you have a traditional organization, looking to drive correlations between the velocity of individual teams and the number of story points that team can execute, not as a matter of trying to compare teams or anything of that, which would be sort of bad metrics, but just from the perspective of trying to get a sense for how much a story point is costing you and what a development team can execute against from a velocity and capacity standpoint, so I can translate that to budgeting, it becomes really important. And so we've got to take off our purist hats and say, we're in the real world now, we're trying to actually build software. The most effective way to do that and to drive towards full agility is to look for ways to align my traditional metrics to my agile execution today. And let's look for those specific areas where we think we can be really effective, not be complete purists about it, be real, be practical. And we've seen a lot of companies and organizations start to have a lot of success in doing that once that sort of opens up. Because the reality is it's happening anyway. You're just not aware of it because all of it's kind of dropping into an Excel and PowerPoint land outside of the core metrics and straight up visibility that portfolio managers would like to have into the work that's actually happening. And so, Hunter, if you have anything to add that, otherwise, let's go ahead and I'll turn it over to you for the 6 steps.
Yep, and good point, Scott. And we really love this slide. We use this slide of processes a lot when we're out starting initial conversations or transformation work at our client sites. You brought up a really good point too. We love to say Agile is a dial, not a switch. Your Agile transformation is a journey, not an endpoint. So these are great ways, as you say, when we are aligning the different camps to get them realizing in many cases their goals are very similar. They just approach things differently. So all good points. So why don't we jump in and talk about some effective ways, as Scott was mentioning, you jump through this. The 6 steps you can see here that we have found are very successful for organizations looking to get into solving that question, my executives are waterfall, my teams are agile, how do we start to align and communicate? And they're the steps you see here on the screen, and we'll jump in and get going with them. Next slide, please, Lexi. So the first step for up is really sitting down with the customer and say, let's define our project intake process. Let's understand your business case, how projects are funded, how they go through your various change management approval gates. Let's take a look at the demand side, the requirement side, if you will, revenue projections, ROI analysis, and the cost side, which of course is everything once a project has been approved down through that delivery pipeline into production. And there are a lot of different ways companies, or we'll work with companies to talk about how do you weight and score and rank those. And even initially, a lot of times we find a lot of organizations are not scoring or ranking things same. It's the old squeaky wheel gets the grease scenario sometimes. So just this first initial process we find a lot of times is very eye-opening from a portfolio planning perspective. Next slide, please, Lexi.
And if I can real quick, Hunter, I think that's, yeah, apologies, Lexi, you can go back 1 second. I think this is someplace that I think is so critical in driving alignment. We'll talk to kind of agile program managers who are, driving the, looking at the portfolio backlog and trying to rank epics and do those, great agile practices at the program level. And then we'll talk to, at the same time, often in the same room, folks from the PMO who are looking to understand, well, where's my, where's my program backlog, and where are my business cases, and how do I rank projects, and where are the scores, et cetera. And I think that the key from an Agile mindset perspective is to embrace the existing demand management and project intake process that exists within the organization today. Because in reality, it aligns really well to the concepts that exist at the highest level of scale within Agile organizations, which is, let's look at all the things the business is trying to do. Let's rank them. Let's assign a business case value to them. And then let's start working on them in rank order and executing against what we can. And so we'll get into in a bit kind of what that means from an execution standpoint. But if you're just looking at the funnel and the intake process and what's happening, really it's the same thing, right? Let's say we need revenue projections. We need to do our way to shortest job first. We need to understand if that's what you're doing. We need to understand some of the core financial metrics that drive this. The same way a traditional portfolio manager kind of would want to understand the scoring and things of that nature. So I don't really see a large, and we don't really see a large discrepancy between how kind of Agile folks want to drive the portfolio backlog and rank epics for execution, and how traditional portfolio managers want to build out kind of the business case and the portfolio of potential projects that could be worked on. Now, when you get to the execution and the staffing models, and that becomes very different, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but there really should be nothing objectionable at all. And so the recommendation we usually give for folks that are trying to drive agility into the portfolio process, but are working with a traditional PMO, is just embrace it, right? We've got the same demand management process. The intake process is effectively the same. And maybe there's some bits of information that we need around, skill sets or times that a more traditional organization might want, and we may or may not use those as we get through and start actually allocating the projects. So thanks, Hunter. Go ahead. Next slide.
Good points. Thank you. So as you mentioned earlier, a good point too is once we've kind of gotten that alignment going and we've gotten folks embracing how to go forward and start thinking of their Agile projects not as pilot or rogue, but as something that is integral into the portfolio and the business, and something that needs to be raised and exposed and understood up through the PMO, up to leadership or whatever. One of the great things we do then is start to establish their strategic planning increments with the PMO. So we, as you mentioned, we take a look at the way the business currently operates, how they plan, how they do their funding cycles, their management cycles, et cetera. And we normally just say here, let's take the annual plan, of course, if it's 2 or 3 years, we'll note that, and let's break it down to where you've got your major check-in or planning gates, and those become your planning increments. In an Agile world, stealing a little bit from the SAFe world, which a lot of large organizations will do if they haven't embraced SAFe yet, is we think of your release planning as your quarters, and your sprints, of course, as your 1 week to 3 week cycles, whatever you're running. But the idea is your planning increments are quarterly, going against an annual plan, an annual funding cycle that includes resources, all the traditional funding, and then the metrics, as you're mentioning, Scott, all the traditional metrics that we need to make sure we are providing the PMO and leadership around both Agile and the traditional waterfall type projects. Next slide, Lexi. So once we've established that strategic planning kind of increment, this is really, in my mind, the funnest part of an Agile transformation. I would almost say, for those of you on the webinar, grab your highlighters, mark the left side of the screen red and the right side of the screen green, because this is really where the magic starts to happen and where PMOs start to understand and really get excited about the concept of Agile and Agile transformations. As we know, in a traditional project team, we bring people to the work. And there are a lot of challenges around that, because in many cases the work isn't ready for the people or the resources, so people are very commonly assigned to multiple projects, multiple initiatives, maybe even crossing lines of business at the same time. This is very, very hard to understand and manage at a portfolio at a dependency level when you've got this many cross dependencies going on between resources and funded work. If we start to shift over to the Agile team concept on the right-hand side, where we're bringing the work to the people, this is a portfolio manager's dream, because now we are tasking work at a team level, not an individual level. We know that that backlog for the team or the portfolio needs to be like a great buffet. It's got small and large work in it. It's got all different types of things, as Scott's mentioning, epics, features, user stories, down to small increments of work. But it is so much easier to understand and track and manage work in an Agile perspective than it is in a traditional waterfall perspective. And if you've used your highlighters on the screen, my apologies. Make sure you erase them off before the IT guy comes by. Next slide. So this, to me too, I really love this slide, Scott. It's one of the neat things and one of the key things that AgileCraft provides. But it really speaks to the need to understand, map, and be honest about our dependencies, both inside individual teams and between teams. And as you were mentioning earlier, Scott, in many cases, this may or may not be going on correctly at the ground level. But it's next to impossible for traditional portfolio waterfall projects to map this out correctly in a linear fashion where we don't know a lot up front, and then to keep it up to date in an ongoing fashion. Whereas in an Agile fashion, practice dependency management, not dependency failure management, is easy to do. We have a large plan for the year. We have release planning, let's say down to the quarterly level. We really dial in then with our Agile teams and say, what do we think are dependencies as we know them to date around this release, around this sprint? And we're constantly going back up to a big wall. You can think of some of our dependency walls when we're doing things manually might be 30 to 50 feet long if I've got 15 or 20 teams involved. But it's done really elegantly in the tool of AgileCraft too as well, whereas you're putting stuff in, it's automatically showing and mapping those dependencies and letting teams know how things are going. Mapping dependencies between teams and the work items is a very critical feature and something that really enables teams to understand and plan and prioritize their work between the teams correctly. And as you mentioned here, when you tie those dependencies to the value of the risk, if they're not delivered, now I get into the beginnings of really neat ROI analysis as well, because now I can further refine that original weighting about a project or a portfolio, and I can say, you know, we've uncovered some additional issues that rises the ROI of this initiative, or it reduces the ROI of this initiative, and that's a data point that PMOs and executives love to see. Aha, so this is going to cost me X, not Y. Do I still want to carry forward with this initiative, or would I put another one at a higher priority or a higher weighting? Next slide, Lexi. This, to me, Scott, really is just a fun, interactive, and valuable exercise to do with clients and Agile transformation teams. As you mentioned in the beginning when we were talking bimodal and we're mapping things out for folks, it's really, really fun, and one of the way Eliassen approaches this in the beginning to get folks' heads wrapped around these concepts of treating traditional projects as Agile epics. We'll put a 30 or 50 foot sheet of butcher paper up on a wall. We'll hand our folks markers, crayons, post-it notes, have them draw out their intake to release process, what we call their delivery pipeline. And then, as you mentioned, we'll put up another piece of paper right below it and say, now let's start thinking of things as epics and features and break them down and figure out how everything would look from an Agile perspective, and then we'll put up an Agile planning board, a portfolio board with months and quarters and years on it and horizontal lines with all the major initiatives, and we'll have them start to map out release planning, how they envision the work could be done and how the resources could align. A lot of people think of this as sprint planning on steroids. It's fun to do manually, but it's impossible to keep live and up to date manually. And again, this is really where AgileCraft shines, and the latest release of AgileCraft really shines because we can take all that information, put it into AgileCraft, and then as things move through the life cycle of the individual Agile initiatives, in the background, AgileCraft is keeping all of that up to date and in sync. Next slide, Lexi. And finally, step 6, this slide brings it all back home to me. Again, thinking of the men are from Mars and women are from Venus, my wife will tell you I work very well under close and constant supervision, which I would agree with her sometimes, especially if you leave me alone in a Home Depot too long. But it's the same way for our Waterfall or our Agile initiatives. On a very regular basis, we want to be checking in with our peers, with our stakeholders, with our PMO, with our executives, and letting them know how things are going. Those are great data points for them as they seek to best understand and move the initiative forwards with the traditional triangle of time, dollars, and resources that are allotted to them through the year. So translating, as you stay here, story points in the financial progress, aligning cost against a team velocity, looking at CapEx and OpEx, which again AgileCraft does really well and allows the team to understand what is the true cost and the true ROI and the current status of this initiative. It's a really great way to get PMOs and executives excited about understanding, wait a minute, I can understand almost week to week or month to month the status of not only my individual Agile project or initiative, but my portfolio of Agile project initiatives, and now I'm very, very empowered as a PMO or executive because I can make decisions on a weekly or monthly basis where in a traditional waterfall only mode, I might not be able to have a clear data point or an understanding of a project and or make a corresponding course correction maybe every 6 months if I'm lucky, more than likely on a 12-month cycle. So Agile really, really here, as you say, reporting back at the team, the program, the portfolio, and the enterprise level around time, money, cost, ROI, and is very empowering and a really great way to bring our PMO and our executives into the picture.
I think this, looking at the first bullet here, I think this is really kind of key and kind of one of the innovations in trying to align Agile execution to traditional portfolio management, and that is imputing the cost of a story point based on team velocity. And so you know, by way of example here, right, different teams may have different costs, different blended rates belong to different cost centers. And so Hunter, if my team is a kind of a low-cost team and has a certain blended rate, say we're $25, $50 an hour, and your team is $100 an hour, well regardless of what our velocities are, right, we should be able to look at our historical velocity, calculate how many story points each one of our teams have produced in the last 5 sprints, look at the blended rate or the cost center for each one of our teams, and we can effectively impute the value or cost of a story point for different teams based on that. And now if I've got a project that's been broken down into stories, and the project is 500 story points and it's allocated between our 2 teams, well, based on the allocation of those story points to your team and my team, based on our respective velocities, based on the cost centers, right, we can predict the actual cost and the estimated cost of that epic or that project versus what we budgeted. And so if we said this was going to be a $500,000 project, but by the time we broke down the story points and assigned it to you and assigned it to me and imputed the cost of those story points, we came back and said, you know what, you've assigned stories to these teams, and the reality is you've assigned $750,000 worth of work against a budget of $500,000. It really allows you to see at a very real level when teams are executing in an Agile way, how that team is doing against the original budget, based on the work that's in the system. And you can do that based on estimates looking out between now and kind of the end of a release cycle or the end of the work for that particular epic across multiple releases. Or you can do it based on actuals and what's happened so far. And if you're running in parallel to that markers on capitalization at the epic and feature level and determining what's capitalizable and what's not, you can roll that information back up. Now, where that becomes extraordinarily useful for organizations that are undergoing an Agile transformation is that they can do all this in parallel to their normal reporting. It doesn't have to replace your core financial metrics. And so when you think about what it means to be an Agile enterprise and doing lean Agile budgeting and allocating dollars to a release train or to a program over time versus the traditional way of we've funded these projects and we're translating and we're reporting against that, you can run your reporting against both the traditional project-based way, right? We've funded this project, we've done so many story points, it costs this much, and we can tell you whether we're on track or off track from a budgetary standpoint. You can run that in parallel to your lean Agile budgeting, where instead of looking at the roll-up of all those epics and projects over the course of a program, you can look at how you funded a release train or a program for a quarter or for a release, and then track your progress against that in parallel. And so if you can effectively toggle back and forth between am I on track from an epic or project-based perspective versus how are my allocations across my different strategic themes doing from a lean Agile perspective. You can track that information from a lean Agile budgeting perspective over time, over the course of quarters and years, and use that information to work in the future with your finance organization, with your HR organization, as you look to really drive the concept of lean and Agile budgeting to the top parts of your organization. And things like capitalization come into play there. We've seen very few companies so far that are effectively able to transition their finance organization into capitalizing based on Agile. And we think by tracking these things in parallel, that it's something that's as you look to drive that full enterprise transition in the future, these data points will be extraordinarily helpful. And so just something we've seen and something that we think organizations are starting to try and take on. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely, very true. And one great point you bring up as well is as we get into transformations, it is empowering at all levels. A team will understand its value and its velocity and how it's helping to move the ball on their initiative, and they can use their metrics, very powerfully to say, here's what's going on, here's what we're doing as a team in comparison to other teams. Management, portfolio, tech managers can use these metrics to take a look at a team maybe that is not performing at a rate they would like, and lift the covers. Hey, do we need some training? Do we have an issue with maybe our test environment is not performing up to snuff, or we've got an operational issue where we need to refresh some of the hardware or some of the network environments. But we're getting that data more real time, not waiting until the end of the project and hearing we're only receiving 60% of our requested value due to various reasons. Executives, as we move through this, a lot of our B and C level executives tell us time and time again it is so fantastic to be able to balance their portfolio, their IT checkbooks every month. So on a very regular basis, as you're mentioning, they can look at their projected cost and their actual cost against, as you're mentioning, how am I doing against the initiative and my goals, and make those real-time decisions based on that quality data. To tell them whether to add a team to one initiative to get it through on time, or to de-scope certain things, or in some cases maybe to reallocate resources from one portfolio initiative to another. So these are very, very, as you say, great things that help drive that understanding and that connection, and help folks see that, that connection of portfolio, traditional waterfall management can coexist very comfortably and start to blend with Agile projects and teams. Lexi, do we have anything from Stephanie or the audience? Any questions, key questions folks would like us to expand on?
Yep, so we're aware of everybody's time, but we figure we'll wrap it up with a couple of questions. So Scott, I will, first question is for you. How can we de-risk the transformation while having both Agile and Waterfall parallel on organization perspective?
Yeah, so I think if I understood the question correctly, the key there is, and from an AgileCraft perspective, by using tooling and processes that allow you to drive a coexistence between those two methodologies, it can help a lot. And so typically the risk comes in play when there are people that are nervous that doing an Agile transformation or reporting on things in an Agile way will cause them to lose visibility and transparency right into the work, which effectively means you can't do the reporting you want, right? Which means you can't provide confidence to your managers and executives that projects are on track or on budget, or that the business is going to get the value that they want. And so by allowing people who are unsure about the viability or the transparency that Agile will provide, allowing them to translate that Agile execution piece into more traditional metrics, we believe gives folks in that position kind of the comfort of understanding that even though the teams are doing Agile, they can still get their normal metrics and they can still present and roll up in a way that's comfortable to them. And that will allow them to basically say, okay, I'm comfortable with the teams moving forward with the Agile transformation because I know I can still do my job, versus hold on a second, if those teams are all going to go Agile, I can't do my job, we're going to lose transparency, that's a bad idea, I don't want to do it, and therefore you teams, you can't transition. And so I think by looking for that alignment and connecting Agile execution to traditional portfolio management, you provide comfort to people who are stuck in the middle, and as the webinar title says, are saying like, help, my teams are Agile and my execs are Waterfall, what do I do? And give them comfort so they don't have to or don't feel they need to inject instability or try and challenge the Agile transformation. Thank you, that's a great question.
Great, thank you. Hunter, this next question is for you. What are the best ways that you find at companies for the scoring portion of the portfolio backlog? Tactically, how do you get execs to align criteria agreements on how to rank and score?
So there are different scoring models out there that we find. I think a big part of it is a lot of what we do in an initial Agile transformations is we'll set up an Agile strategic team that usually is a mix of IT and business managers or executives, and we define a lot of this with them up front and say, what are you traditionally doing today? And let's take a look at ways, as Scott just mentioned, how to rank and weight and score different things, and let's come to an agreement up front. And in many cases we find today a lot of traditional waterfall shops that may have a little bit of Agile going, but as Scott's mentioning, it's not really working up into the portfolio level. They don't have a standard scoring, weighting, ranking mechanism. It's the squeaky wheel, or it's the team that folks say is generating the most revenue at the company that gets the most work. Another interesting model we like to look at is what percentage of your work or throughput, delivery pipeline throughput, is new business, and what is stabilization or operations, or what some people call refactoring. So we have different models or different recommendations we like to start teams at when they're going Agile, saying certainly a percentage of your work is new business, revenue generating, expanding the company, etc. But a decent percentage of that as well should be operational stability, enhancement, architecture, refactoring, etc. So we usually put all of those into the mix and work with them to come up with a common ranking model that then is agreed to by all. And once we have that agreement, that understanding, then we can start, and they can start to rank items very quickly. And the process then takes the he said, she said out of it, because now they're following an agreed to process. But a great question, thank you.
Great, we have a lot of questions rolling in, but we want to buy back our audience time, so I'm going to wrap the webinar up with one last question. The question is, From the very initial phase, how do you get executives to even be open to Agile, considering they may have bad past experiences where they aren't even open to Agile?
Scott, I'll take the first pass and leave the last words to you, I think. This is a lot of what Eliassen walks into nowadays when we are called in by a large organization, small or large, I should say, to talk to them about where are they today. I would say over 50% of our initial client interactions for customers that have not had a great experience. A lot of times, as Scott has reminded us through the whole presentation, we look to understand where they are today, understand how they have approached things today, and establish that communication path of that guiding coalition with the executives to say, would you like your business to be more efficient? Would you like it to be more effective? Would you deliver more software efficiently, deliver more through the pipeline of the traditional time, dollars, and resources that you have allotted today? Would you like to have a better understanding, not an annual understanding, but maybe a monthly understanding of how your initiatives are running, cost versus actuals, CapEx versus OpEx? Usually when we sit down and start asking those type of questions, they say yes, absolutely would love that. And then we'll go into, well, talk to me about why it hasn't worked so well before for you in the past. And at least with Eliassen, we establish roadmaps then. We'll do assessments and we establish actually individualized roadmaps for our customers when we're doing a transformation that says, we believe you are here today on your Agile journey or your Agile transformation, and here are some steps we can recommend and we would like to invest with you to move you along this journey, along this pipeline. And a lot of them we have discussed today specifically. But it is a journey or almost an approval to proceed type of cycle where we'll make a couple of changes, we'll make a couple of enhancements, we'll check back in them going, is this looking well? Great, let's keep going.
Yeah, that's great, and I'll just conclude by saying, typically when we walk into an organization where a past Agile transformation has failed, it's because historically the Agile transformation has been only at the team level. And there's been no mechanisms in place to drive executive alignment up through the multiple levels of the organization so that they have comfort and understanding around how things are going. It's kind of the black hole syndrome. So we actually get called into a lot of those situations where organizations are looking to solve that problem by putting in the processes and the tooling that allow for kind of full alignment for everybody from the executive all the way up to, from the engineer all the way up to the executive. So thank you. Another great question, and thank you everybody for your time today. I know we're looking to give folks some time back. Thank you, Lexi and Stephanie, for supporting us here, and Hunter for co-presenting, and appreciate everybody's time.
Thanks, everybody. As Scott said, we will follow up with everybody in a follow-up email as well as touch base on any additional questions offline. Thanks for being a part of today's webinar. Thank you to Scott. Thank you to Hunter. And on behalf of Eliassen Group and AgileCraft, we hope you enjoyed the presentation. Have a good day.